First, it was the United States Secretary of State who went on a trip to Africa. Now it is the Vice President of the United States of America. And later in the year, the President himself is expected to come to Africa. These visits by top figures in the U.S. administration reflect the U.S.'s desire to strengthen ties with the continents where the influence of China and Russia is on the rise. Now, during the visit, Harris announced more than $1 billion in public and private money for economic development, $100 million for security assistance in West Africa, and $500 million to facilitate trade with Tanzania. However, there's this skepticism about whether the U.S. will follow through on its promises, and Harris has been faced with not so subtle hints that Africa expects more. For Accra, Ghana, the first point of visit of the American Vice President, I have joining me Paul Frimpong, who is an economist and Executive Director, Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining this conversation. All right, Paul, you will need to unmute your device so that we can hear you properly.
Sure, sorry. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. Now, looking at these three countries that U.S. Vice Presidents visited, that is Kamala Harris, what would you say the center of attraction is, and how symbolic is this for Africa and the United States?
Well, thank you very much. I think if you track in the first quarter of 2023, we've seen a high-level profile U.S. Government officials which have been in Africa since January 2023 to now. And this followed even a more symbolic events, which was the second U.S. African Day Summit that was held in December 2022 in Washington, D.C. That saw over 40 African head of state and ministers of finance and trade visiting Washington, D.C. to dialogue with President Biden and the team of the U.S. to really look at the new strategy that they put forward for the African relations. So, and they followed it up, like I said earlier, in the first quarter of 2023 with numerous high-profile visits. The Treasury Secretary has been in the continent. We've had the IMF, which of course, you know, we all know works alongside the U.S. government foreign policy as well. And then, of course, now we have the Vice President. So it quite shows you that we're now seeing a revived enthusiasm in terms of the U.S. interest in the continent. And for us as Africa, we've seen this kind of development in the past, of course. And now we are getting this kind of attention from different parts of the world. I mean, we have India is here, we have UAE is here, of course, we have China here, Turkey, Russia, everyone. So for me, I think it boils down to know, because all of these partners, let's not beat about the bush, have their own interests and the agenda. So we have to be asking ourselves what we intend to gain from this kind of partnership that is in the rise continent, so that we don't become a pawn in a scheme where we are being used, our backyard is being used to settle scores with any partner. We are here to protect the interests of the continent of Africa. So that should be our priority. So it's very symbolic. I mean, like I said, it's following their new interest and commitments in the continent that we want to do more with Africa now than we ever did in the past.
All right, so we are seeing, just as you have said, that there's a lot of concerns and interests coming to play in terms of these sort of agreements and relationship being put in place by the superpowers. Talk about Russia, talk about US, talk about China, and of course the European Union that was all over Africa last year. But then let's begin to look at the countries one after the other. Let's take Zambia as a case study, where the Vice President visited. The Zambian government, that is the President of Zambia, that's Hakainde Hichilema, used the opportunity to appeal to the U.S. President to help restructure its debts, because that is one major issue that has lingered on for a long while, most especially for China, that has dragged that conversation for so long. And of course, the Vice President came out to say that, yes, it is time for the critical lenders, the creditors, as it were, to also speed up the process so that there could be a bit of debt debt burden, a reduction in debt burden for Zambia. Now, do you think that anything can be done, most especially with these visits, for Zambia to have its debt restructured speedily and, of course, reduce the debt burden?
Well, with the issue about debts has been going on for a while. Of course, Zambia is a hot seat when it comes to the debt crisis, supposed debt crisis that we are facing on the continent. So I think it was very symbolic. I think the other U.S. even leaders that came up also visited Zambia. And for me, I think when we look at the debt discussion that we are having and restructuring debt, of course, the visit of the vice president does not necessarily is not going to lead to any process of speeding up the process of debt restructuring, because if you look at the debt portfolio of countries in the sub-region, especially Zambia and Ghana case, we're also going through a program with the IMF. We'll come to that, I'm sure. We look at the portfolio in terms of the component of the creditors that these countries owe. We are talking about 70, in some cases, about 80% of them being owed to commercial lenders. So countries that raise euro bonds, these are money that has, took from private, hedge funds, private equity funds, sovereign wealth funds in Wall Street, in London, that actually in Hong Kong, that invested, in these euro bonds. So those are majority. We look at the external debt, of most of these countries. That is where the majorities of their debt are. Even the component of China is not that much. Just that we look at the share size as a single creditor, that is when the issue about China becomes an issue. Even in Ghana, the whole external debt of China owes just 3%. So we owe just 3% of our external debt is to China. So it's not really about the fact that China has to be. So when you look at the rhetoric, when you track the kind of conversation that's happening, even when the IMF, managing director visited, right? It's more, I see a trend where it's an avenue to send caution. It's an avenue to sort of slow down the kind of engagement that some of the countries are having with countries like China, right? So for me, it's not going to speed up the process, because you went to the international capital market to borrow, unless you have any bilateral debt relation that you can speed up. Maybe you have with the US or EU, that some of these conversations from the vice president can weigh in and help you to speed up the process. Otherwise, the standard debt that you owe to commercial lenders, nothing is going to happen to it.
All right. Well, talking about the diversification of the Ghanaian economy beyond natural export of resources. Now, the president, Nana Akufo-Addo, said that he is envisioning a Ghana beyond aid. So now you are saying that you don't see any sort of speed up in the process of debt restructuring for Zambia. But in the case of Ghana, do you think that this US-Africa relationship will bring any sort of good for Ghana and its economy? And if that will happen, how do you think that Ghana can best position itself to achieve this?
Well, let's not beat about the bush. Of course, we all know how strong the US economy is and what it means to have such a country as a partner in so many fronts. Of course, there has been a dwindling sort of enthusiasm when it comes to the US relation with countries on the continent. It has, when you look at all the indexes that matter to the continent of Africa, countries on the continent, look at talking about building the economy back, infrastructure investment, FDI flows, and all of that. The US has been falling short in terms of trade with countries on the continent. The US is not the leading country in terms of partnering with so many countries here on the continent. In Ghana, in case of Ghana, of course, our largest trading partner is China, and it has been for over a decade now. So for me, we stand a chance to do a lot with the US, but more so if the strategy can change to a point where we discuss in terms of what we believe we need as a country, as Ghana. These are our priority areas. These are the areas we would like to collaborate. Are you in a position? Are you willing to provide the needed partnership that we need to secure these areas of our priorities that we're looking at? So for me, that is a fundamental. If that does not change, and we will still be going about, trying to do what is being told, what we've been told to do, like we've had in the period, years back, as we've seen, then nothing is going to happen. We might not be able to benefit. And beyond it, as you mentioned, that's been one of the key drivers or agenda of the current president of Ghana, that we want Ghana beyond aid. we've all seen the story about aid has not been pleasant on the continent. Billions of dollars have been thrown on the continent in the name of aid, and nothing has been achieved. We are saying that now we want to do business, we want to trade, we want to invest, we want to bring your enterprises here, we want to also have our enterprises back there in your country. We want to see us as partners, not a place where you can dump your aid and feel good about it. And then you turn around to tell me what I have to do, what laws I have to change. That era, I believe, is getting past now. So if we can get to a level where we can negotiate, we can talk, we can explain that as a country, this is where we are in our development journey. These are the key priority areas for us. And if we're a partner and you can be a part of this journey, why not? We have a lot that you have interest in. We have a lot of natural resources that is being exported to the US all these years. But what is it that we are getting in return? Absolutely nothing. So for me, I think if that strategy can change, where we can dialogue and have a conversation, that this is what we are looking at as a country. In the next 5 years, these are priority areas. We want to invest in education, we want to invest in healthcare, we want to invest in roads and rails. These are things that we need. And if that can happen, of course, US, I believe, is still in a position to help in these areas.
But then if I'm going to take from your words, Paul, you talked about the need for Africa to get funds and some sort of investment in the area of education, infrastructural development, and all of the critical sectors of the economy. But then Africa has gotten aids, grants, funds from international creditors over the course of 2 decades or more. And we've not seen any tangible transitional developments in these areas. So would you peg the fault, or would you peg the fault at the table of these international superpowers, as the case may be? Or you think, or you would say that it is these African governments that are not really channeling the funds in the areas that would bring about some sort of visible development in the areas that it is needing?
Look, I think we also, of course, nobody can just push all the blame on the table of someone. As I said earlier, everyone is in to protect the interests of the economy, of their citizens, right? And we've seen numerous reports in terms of corruption. There are a lot of corruption-related activities when it comes to leadership on the continent. We've not had the best of leadership. Let's be frank about that. In our own way, we've not had the best of leadership for countries in the continent in the past few decades. And that, of course, has led to some of these challenges that we're facing as a continent, being not able to actually lead and be able to transform our economy. So the blame is squarely on the table of African leaders as well, in terms of what we've not been able to do, even the little resources that we gain. But that is where I even like the approach that China uses, which is what even has been spoken against by some quarters, which is not true, because China is doing what you call resource for development, right? So, and this has been something that China did in its own development agenda, which is in the 1970s. They took a $10 billion worth of loan from Japan, and then Japan came in to dig the oil in China, take it back to Japan, and in exchange, develop infrastructure, the rails, and all the technological advancement of China through the $10 billion loan that they got from Japan. And that's the similar situation that we are facing on the continent, that if you want the roads, you want the railways, we have the capacity, we have the technical ability to do it. You have resources here. Why do you have to go? And this is the channel that we use in the cycle that we used to, which is now changing, right? So we take the natural resources in the raw form, we export it in the raw form, of course, get a few because it's not processed or anything. Then the money comes back. Now we are now going to find contractors to pay them money, and that's where all the corruption-related activities happen. But in the case of China, it's resources for development. You need rails, which is going to cost you, let's say, $100 billion to connect, let's say, Lagos to Abuja. I'm going to do that for you, but in exchange, give me an oil block. It's the same way. You are already taking the oil, exporting, you know, even, what do you call it, refining the oil. And then you have to go and buy oil back using the money. And then we know what happens to this kind of foreign earnings that comes to the country through the porous political leadership that we have. So for me, I think we have to re-strategize and see how we want to see. Like you said, money comes in, money has been poured in, but we're not using it well. We're not using it well as ourselves to be able to develop the things that we need. So this alternative of being able to match our resources to the development that we need, I think is a brilliant step for the country.
All right, talking about monies now, $1 billion for economic development coming from the United States to Africa, $100 million for security assistance, $500 million to assist trade, between United States and Tanzania. And now there is this concern about if the administration of Joe Biden will be able to get congressional support to galvanize this financial commitments. He has already pledged to the African continent. Do you think that the United States Congress would be an impediment to these monies coming out of the United States coffers down to Africa?
Well, I believe we all want to see some of these the action following these talks, because there has been a number of U.S. Africa policy and programs that have not actually yielded the results stemming from the kind of commitment that was made by the U.S. government. So we want to see that this time around, real business is being done. And of course, when the African leaders were in the U.S. in December 2015, that's when all these pledges were made. That's when the U.S. launched a new Africa strategy and all of that. That's when and frankly speaking, we heard most of African leaders speaking there right in front of Biden that, please, it's time to change the strategy that you're using with Africa. It's time to do business. It's time to invest. So I believe that if the U.S. has the capacity, they have the capacity to marshal, they have the capacity to bring along the private sector, drive to invest in the continent. And we all know the U.S. is the largest capitalist country. The whole U.S. economy is built by the private sector. So they have the experience, they have the expertise, they have the insight, they have the right, technical ability to put together a strategy or program that will line up many U.S. African businesses and enterprises to now look at the continent in a different way that they used to. That is a continent where doing business is not sustainable. But now it's sustainable because others have done it. They've done it successfully when you left the scene. So I believe they have the capacity to do that, and that will really go a long way to help us Africa, because that's our interest. We want to develop. We need the resources, we need the technical abilities, we need the technology to be able to transform our economy. So that would be a welcome development if we can see some level of action. And I believe if they stick to their plans and their commitment, US can actually lead this and bring all these investments onto the continent.
All right, Paul, before I let you go, let me be a little bit cheeky here, because you've talked about the fact that there's a need for a change in strategy and, of course, for Africa to set the tone for discussions that can bring about some positivity in this relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. Now, there is this speculation that this is more or less like a geopolitical game for U.S., most especially looking at the fact that China had gained inroad into Africa way before now, and so it's a battle of competition and of course a scramble for Africa and its resources, and not necessarily for the need to have that strong bilateral ties with the African continent. In about a minute or two, I'd like you to just look at that speculation and have your thoughts on that.
No, I think it's more so a confirmed speculation, as you say, because if you look at the rhetoric of the U.S. leaders the past couple of years leading to 2023, it's always about countering China's influence on the continent, right? What have they been trying to do? Even in Ghana, I did mention, I even wrote a paper on this issue about the debt restructuring and how the US is now pushing Ghana to go and talk to China and get China to cancel your debt and all of that. We have to be very careful as a continent that our house, our continent, our home is not used as a battleground to settle any score. We are in for our own interest. We want to work with the right partner. We want to work with a partner that understands our development needs. We want to work with a partner that is willing to come here, be on the ground with us, and help us change the structure of our economies. That's what we're looking for. So I do not subscribe, and that has been the challenge. Of course, we all know there are a lot of negative rhetoric from the US, from the West led by US, China's role in Africa, but we know who our partners, the right partners we want. We know, we decide. These are 54, 55 independent countries, which all have their own rules and regulations of engagement. So they decide which country they want to relate with, which country they want to trade with. So I want to send a sign of caution that African leaders and African countries has to be very careful that we don't become, a battlefield, a battleground for anyone to settle any score. We are doing this, we mean business, we want to transform our economies, and whoever is here to help out, China has been here, they've been doing tremendous work. For the first time, we've seen a lot of real hard infrastructures mushrooming across the continent, so many countries. Even this, last year or so, there was a launch of the new port, a state-of-the-art port in Nigeria, launched by China. And so we're seeing real infrastructure, and that has been, Africa has been speaking the infrastructure deficit song for decades, and nothing was done about it when we're dealing with our traditional partners, especially the US. Now all of a sudden we have China that's coming in, stepping in, providing all these infrastructure gaps. So for me, I think it's about we standing our ground and deciding that this is what is in the best interest of us, and we will do business with anyone, with India, with Turkey, with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the UK, France, US, anyone is welcome to business on the continent. And we will not allow, we shouldn't allow anyone to use us as a pawn. Scheme. So for me, I think that should be the way forward for the continent.
Okay, let's just quickly wrap things up now, Paul. Now, let's look at the AFCFTA, because we're seeing this sort of partnership options coming to Africa now. So how do you think Africa can actually leverage that particular agreement to bolster its bilateral ties and economy? Just in about a minute, please.
I think from the onset, the EFA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, should be at the forefront of most of the conversation that we have in our development, especially the advanced and developed economies like the US, the UK, the EU, China, India, all these big, large economies. The Africa, the AFCFTA should be at the forefront whenever we are dealing with this country, because the AFCFTA actually has made us create a common market of over 1.4 billion people access of market access that could be created. In the past, you see that we're dealing with these countries in a tiny, fragmented, small country level, sitting on the table with China, trying to cut a deal in trade. Obviously, that's not going to work. So I foresee going forward, and the good part is that most of these countries are now also develop their core strategies to deal with the continent. So we have to approach them with the AFCFTA. For example, China has what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the largest infrastructure development connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa in the history of the world. Nothing like that has been done before. So where and how do we fit in the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? That is how we should approach it. The US new strategy for Africa. How do we marry that with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? How do they fit in terms of how they want to do business with the country? So it's very significant. Now that we passed it and it's working, I believe we can leverage on the AFCFTA to get the best of the deals in terms of bilateral relations and multilateral relations.
Well, the way we see it now, Africa is in its best stead to see how conversations can be driven in terms of economical growth for the continent. But of course, just like you said, it's all about strategy and leveraging on the available resources so that Africa can drive the conversation upward for some sort of growth as it is hoping for. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining the conversation.
Thank you for having me.